Hi, I'm Simon Thorpe. I work with a product group here at Twilio for our authentication service called Authy. And I'm just going to do a quick 5-minute, what the heck does that mean, why would you use it, then stop believing me and start believing Andrew, because he's an actual customer and he has deployed it. So far more credible than I am. First of all, this story kind of ties in a little bit with why, not only why we're looking at authentication, but actually authentication in enterprise scenarios. And another of our customers, Dell, actually made this statement, which I think is very true, is when you're looking at adding functionality to your application from a security perspective, there is a base level of expectancy from your customers. And one of the things your customers expect to do is just protect their data and their users. That's a given, and it's a very obvious statement, but I just want to remind everybody that's what we're in the business, specifically in my product, is about protecting and securing your customers' data in your applications. And the biggest problem today is this chart. So this is sort of data that came out in 2015. There's lots and lots of files and stuff on the internet that you can go find that has username and passwords in it. So a company went off and found all that data, and then they also had access to some companies who had internal information about usernames and passwords, and they just aggregated all this stuff up and produced a graph or a chart. And as you can see, it's horrendous. I even look at this and don't believe I'm seeing this. That cannot be true, that people are still using passwords like this. So passwords are horrendous. People are still using bad passwords, and you can see it's not changing from year to year, right? So they did this in 2014, it didn't change in 2015, and I tell you now, I read the news every day. People are always being told, don't use these as passwords. So it's not a good situation. So, but we can actually increase the security around accounts that even have these types of passwords, and we do that with something called two-factor authentication. So who in the room is familiar with two-factor authentication? That is everybody apart from one person. I'm not going to single you out. Yeah, that's everybody in the room, which is great. So two-factor authentication, essentially the factor piece of this is when I'm authenticating to something, I have to give it information. Because humans are really good at doing this. I can walk up to my mum, and within a second it's like, I know you're Simon, you're my son, I've blah, blah, blah. All these factors are involved in that instant authentication. A computer is dumb. It does not know who I am. I have to give it information to authenticate. So in a two-factor authentication mode, it's my initial factor is a username, a password, or something of that nature. The second factor is something else. Now you could use something that you know, but again, something you know is what our username and password is, and it's not very good because if somebody else knows it, they can use that to authenticate. So we have other factors, such as something you have. Way back in the late 70s and 80s, RSA developed this idea where you could carry around a token generating device that was specific to you and your account, and it built this number, and this number was used as part of your login. It's because you had that thing. Just because somebody else knows my username and password, they don't have this thing, they can't get into my account. And many of us will enter the building and swipe a card to get into the building. That's a physical access control system with something that I have, which is my smart card. And then we're seeing more and more biometrics populate common consumer devices like phones, Apple's Touch ID being a very common example there. I stick my thumbprint on the phone and it unlocks whatever I want to get access to. So two-factor authentication is leveraging more of these factors, typically one more, hence the two, to get into an account. So here is your application. It has data with users in there. There's a bunch of business logic which is specific to your app, and there's a whole presentation layer. Now in an enterprise scenario, you're building this application, your customers come to you and say, hey, I want you to provide single sign-on, I want you to better manage my users, I want you to connect me to Active Directory, because that's what we see in the enterprise, a great deal of on-premises infrastructure that's still around even though they want to use cloud services. So you go to your customer and you say, stick identity management in front of it. And there are lots of vendors out there. Microsoft have technologies, Okta have a technology, CA, IBM. There's all these companies that provide these big identity management platforms that your customers can use in front of your application. Now, that's great for things like single sign-on and synchronizing attributes with on-premises directories. But the problem is what you're saying to your customer is, to get better security to the system, specifically now enterprise platforms talk about MFA as opposed to 2FA, usually the same type of techniques. But they're saying that to get this feature, you've got to go off and spend more money and do a project to deploy another technology. And really, is that the right approach? So what we're saying is, instead of building these wonderful applications and your customers coming to you and saying, I want X, Y, and Z around how I do this, but I want you to keep my accounts secure. And one of the best ways to keeping those accounts secure is using more factors as part of the authentication process. Instead of saying to them, go and buy a product and deploy that and switch on their two-factor authentication service, why not just add it into your applications yourself? And I thought I got to the end of the slides, but I haven't, because I've just reminded myself, you don't want to build this all yourself from scratch. So if you go back to your application, you've got your login logic, your 2FA logic, and your profile logic. Essentially, somebody comes to your application, they need to switch this feature on. How do I configure 2FA? How do I tell you my phone number? How do I tell you what my device is that you're going to use? That's in your profile logic. You want control over that. You want to be able to display that in amongst all the other details that you have. This needs to be inside your application. You stick another layer of identity management in front, you're going to lose that control and that rich experience. Then somebody logs in, they're going to log in, and as part of that login, you want to provide that 2FA phase. You want control over that. And the 2FA itself, you want to put logic around that. You want to change the way it's presented to the end user. You might make decisions based on intimate information within your application. But how this thing works is you've got to build a 2FA service behind it. And the first thing you want to do, those codes, that RSA codes, we still use those today, and we call that a one-time password. There are different mechanisms. There's something called a time-based one-time password, or TOTP. But essentially, it's about getting a code which the end user uses as part of the login phase. How do you get that to them? Well, you could build yourself an app and have that app on the phone generate that token for them. It works offline. You don't need a communications channel to the phone. This is our app, by the way, so we have this solution. So you want to build that logic into your platform, but what if they don't have a smartphone? Well, you've then got to communicate it to them. How do you communicate it? Call them up, send them an SMS. You could use Twilio. You could use other vendors. What happens if your gateway is not working to those vendors? So you've just got to start to build that functionality. And if you want to do the latest versions of 2FA, the best way to do it using the richest user experience, which we'll have a look at in a second, you've got to build all that functionality, and you've got to notify that phone that something's happening. You've got to do that depending on the type of phone, whether it's an Apple phone or a Google-based phone. Then they've got to communicate back to you. And it goes on. You've got to then monitor and maintain and test this whole system. I guarantee you that building all this is not easy. Why do I know that? We've built this. We've built this entire platform, and it's not easy. There's a lot of functionality we've built in this cloud service to make it easy for you to integrate. So don't go off and build this yourself. It is, a lot of people say, building your own security, not a good idea. Leave it down to the experts. Just build into your application the stuff that really adds value to your application. So we have a whole cloud service that does all this for you. There's a simple REST API. You come and talk to us. We do all the monitoring for it. We maintain it. We test it. We support it. We support it. Your end users are tied to the phone for authenticating to your website. They lose their phone. Now what? What happens if they try and communicate with you and say, oh, this is my new phone number? Is that really them? How are you assured that that's not some fraudulent activity? So our cloud service is not just about functionality. We are supporting your end users to help them make the right decisions and also weed out those fraudulent and illegitimate requests to change their identity. And as I said, it is pretty straightforward. There are 3 API calls that you're making. 1, to tell us about the user in the first place. 2, to send us the request to actually generate the first part of the 2FA. And then 3, handling what happens next. So tell us about the user, send out a request, and that's either an SMS or a voice call or a push notification to their phone. And then 3rd, do something about it. Verify the information they're giving you or handle the response that they've done on the phone. So that's what 2FA is. Now what I want to do is introduce you to Andy Fleming, the CTO of a company that's actually deployed this in their service.
Hey, my name's Andy Fleming. I'm the CTO at Zesty.io. We are an enterprise website platform, so we provide a CMS solution as well as host the actual website, and then we even provide some tools for developing online. And we do all that as a SaaS platform. So as a SaaS platform, security is obviously important, especially for enterprise. And we already kind of had 2-factor authentication on our roadmap. We planned to build it. But last year we had a specific customer that it was on their actual requirements. And so that pushed it to the top of our roadmap or the front. And so we started looking for a solution. So I explored a few options for 2-factor in the past. I've actually implemented 2-factor authentication using something called Alter Ego, which isn't around anymore, as well as Google Authenticator. And those solutions are okay. But my first thought was, maybe I'll just build this myself. I'll use Twilio and their text messaging. Shouldn't be that bad. And I think as developers, a lot of times we're a little bit crazy. Our first instinct is always to build it ourselves, right? And thankfully, I caught myself pretty early and said, why don't I give Authy a look?
And Andy, if you've got kids, you'll recognize Dr. Doofenshmirtz from Phineas and Ferb. There you go. Always building stuff himself, and what happens to it? It always blows up.
So I figured, if implementation goes well and smoothly, it's an easy win. And in researching Authy, I actually came across a couple other really big things that kind of pushed me over the edge. The biggest thing was the fact that they have a managed recovery process, because that's not just technical implementation that needs done, that's actual business operations, right? How do I handle when someone has a new device or when they need to recover their device or things like that? And because they support that process, that'll save me potentially money as well as training my team on how to handle those security situations. Instead, I can say, point them to Authy, and then that process is handled for us. The other big thing along with that as well is multi-device management. And the other kind of backstory with some of that is I had actually used Google Authenticator for some stuff, and I personally had an experience where I actually lost my Google Authenticator kind of data on my phone somehow, and so I had to go through the recovery process for another account. And and I'm technically savvy, I'm a developer, so it's I shouldn't run into situations like that, but somehow I did. So it's not it's not crazy to think that a customer who isn't technically savvy might run into that same situation. So immediately I saw the value in Authy. This could save me some headaches later. So I started on the implementation. Everything went pretty smoothly. There's existing libraries, for different languages. There's clear documentation. And we really kind of deployed it without much fuss. To be honest, I wasn't sure though at first, if this is actually going to work for all parties involved, right? We have these enterprise customers, we have, developers as well as users across the world, and then plus our own internal usage. This was something we were going to have to use day to day. But we deployed it, and kind of week after week just rolled by, and it was just silence, which was a dream. So that was a great feeling, right? Just when it goes off without a hitch, and that really was our experience. So fast forward to this year, and I was actually, I was sitting down having lunch with another colleague, and he told me about a security tool that they implemented and tied into their platform where all they had to do was press a button to log in. They didn't even have to copy over a code or anything like that. And I was, I played it off as yeah, we're fine. We have a two-factor implementation. But secretly, I was a little bit jealous. I wanted the one push button in that. Thankfully, it was only a little bit later that Authy came out with One Touch, which is basically their version of One Touch login as well as this kind of approval request process.
Maybe we should have called it One Button.
One button, yeah. So here's what that implementation actually looks like in our product. So this is after you log in to Zesty. You type in your username and password. You're presented with this screen if you have two-factor enabled. And it will either let you type in a code still. So if you're using it via SMS or want to do that for some reason, you can do that. But it also, at the same time, is going to send a notification to your phone. If you have the Authy app installed and all that set up, you can actually just open that request, and it's going to say, hey, we see that you're trying to log in. Is this you? And you can just say approve. It'll approve that request, and then we automatically redirect you to the dashboard. So the payoff is huge, right? It's slightly more complicated than the basic, code kind of integration, but it really is still pretty simple. And the payoff's awesome, right? Just to be able to tap approve, log in, it feels good. It's something I actually use day to day. So immediately it just it saves you that little bit of time. And even though it's small, it feels so much better, and your customers are having that same experience. So as we kind of thought about that implementation, we got that part all in there. We really started to think about what else we can do with this, right? Because we have a secure notification system where we can approve requests. So we immediately saw the potential to do things like privileged actions. Let's say someone's going to do a secure action like change the email address on their account. We could use this same process, even though they're already logged in, to confirm that action. And that is almost a second layer on top of protecting from things like CSRF and that. If there's something you missed, by adding additional authentication, you're providing that other layer of protection.
Can I answer that? That's an interesting point, Andy, because in the login, the person responding to that approval request is the person logging in.
Right.
But very immediately, you've pointed out that if I'm going to change the email address on the account, the person that actually gets that approval request might not be the person making the change. It might be the person that actually owns the account. So really quickly, you can see that just sending that text code or something of that nature, or having that code, works really well for logins, especially as a degraded experience if you don't have a network connection. But this really is more about transactional approvals than it is really the login. I think if we'd have designed this in a slightly different way or pitched it in a different way, we might have started with approving transactions before we'd applied it to a login.
Yeah. And there's a ton of use cases for that. The other thing that we thought of is we could use it even for things like publishing workflows. So when you have a page that one user wants to publish, not only can we authorize that user, but we can actually send that request to a different user, like a supervisor who might be approving that, and then they can approve that. And that can, some of that can happen in the background, like they can submit that request and that user can move on while that kind of request is being processed in the background. But we can still use that same kind of process to do that. And for us, we don't have a mobile app right now, nor do we really, think we need one at this point. And what's great is we can leverage Authy to basically provide that secure notification system without having to really write any code. So immediately, since we already have one touch enabled, it's just a little more work to tie that to certain actions. So kind of looking back now, Authy's been a great choice for us. The implementation was easy. It met our customer standards as well as our own. And we really haven't had a single problem with it. So we're really happy.
Right, that was honestly, I haven't seen. I'm still here thinking, wow, he's saying great things, and I hadn't actually seen any of the content because we've been rushing to get this ready. So, let me ask you one question. So we're using the phrase the implementation was easy. Can you quantify that? I mean, really, in real terms, what was involved going from no 2FA to actually having a solution in production?
I don't know if I can quantify it specifically. It really depends. I would say it's something, if it was important to you and you were doing it on top of other priorities, it's something you can add in a weekend really easily. Obviously depends on the complexity of your authentication code in that. But for us, it was quick. When I added one touch, I talked one weekend about it, with Simon while I was up in San Fran visiting. And the next weekend, I implemented it. It wasn't really on our roadmap, but it was something I dealt with every day and, had to deal with. So I thought, why not? And I threw it in there, and it was pretty easy.
Just for any developers who might be watching or sitting here listening, this might be a difficult question to answer because you might not want to reveal this information as, security through obfuscation.
Sure.
But the authentication phase that you have, is that just part of the framework? Were you literally adding the lines after that, or had you written some of your own authentication, or how did that work?
So we have our own custom authentication logic. Obviously, we follow standards-based stuff, but basically we would, we added it as a layer on top where basically we said if the user has two-factor enabled but has not authorized that particular session, then it would force them basically back to that two-factor page. So they basically can't take any actions in the meantime.
Right, I gotcha. Okay, so you already had existing code and you were integrating into that the calls out to us and the logic as to whether you would and wouldn't present it.
Yeah, so that was pretty centralized for us already, keeping it kind of clean and secure that way. So then it was just that simple layer on top.
And I think the final thing that I'd like to bring up is your use case is quite interesting in the sense that your customer was coming to you and saying, not only do we need 2FA, you have to enforce it for everybody. So the customer is saying, I need 2FA, and actually saying mandate it. And if you look at a lot of consumer sites out there, so Twitch recently launched with our service, And when I talk to those guys, they're like, well, we have to let the user opt in because we can't enforce this type of security on them because of the extra steps it might take, and also if you get it wrong, you need to make sure you're capturing data in the right way. So there's a couple of issues in enforcing it. And then we have another customer, Coinbase, that uses us. They enforce it for everything. You can't create an account if you don't switch on 2FA. Now, what's the difference between Coinbase and Twitch? Twitch is I'm going to show somebody while I'm playing a game, which is important, but the impact to you as an end user is not it's not financial if somebody compromises your account. Whereas Coinbase, from the get-go, you cannot create an account without this extra security because there's money in this account that somebody could take. So it's interesting to see how in between the two there are demands where your customers might be saying to you, for my users in my system, for my segment of users within your platform, make sure that 2FA is enabled because I don't trust the people in my company accessing your platform securely. So that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, to touch on that, basically, it was a requirement. They said for all our users, we want to have two-factor authentication enabled. But being a platform, anyone can create a user and anyone can create a site. You can be associated with multiple sites. So we had to add a layer to actually say, if you want to access and edit this website, you need to have two-factor enabled. So what's cool is we kind of made that experience nice, where people who opted in, can already access it, and if not, they get a nice message, hey, before you can access this site, go over here to enable two-factor authentication, and then we can provide that at kind of an organization level.
And I think that ties back into the enterprise aspect of this. So you could go off and build all this yourself. As Andy said, you could just go to Twilio, use an SMS platform, get a library that creates the code, go write your own push notification. I mean, you could do all of that yourself. There's a lot of effort involved, and there's a lot of risk in doing that from a security perspective. The opposite end of that is you could go buy a classic legacy identity product, stick it in front of your service, and have it enforce a 2FA on the way through the door. But you're going to lose all the value and all the ability to do what Andy's just mentioned, which is customizing the actual process inside your application for certain limits, and it's going to be branded in his application, and that is so important. All the user experience of modern applications is night and day to what we had 10-15 years ago when we were building applications, and end users now have this incredibly high expectation of people like Facebook, doggone it, have gone and added this incredibly high level of quality of interaction with their service. Now that when I go back and I use some old Oracle, Microsoft type technologies, it's like, oh my God, this is like being in the dark ages. It's just this old horrible UI, and it's moved so quickly. You've got to have control over that experience, and that's why I think Twilio and other companies are doing so fantastically well with APIs, because you don't have to build the functionality behind it, but you just have this nice little endpoint where you're extracting that functionality and injecting it into your overall flow. So anyway, thank you, Andy. I was getting all passionate then. Do you want to hit the next slide? Anyway.
Sure.
So want to reach out to us, hit us up, Twitter, and yeah, thanks very much. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah.